Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Alison, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Mojca Hrabar from Oikos, the research partner from Slovenia. Our focus is actually the Ljubljana urban region. And I'm going to facilitate today this webinar. We got quite a lot of examples to be presented, and I have to thank all the presenters. We will have an example from Gloucestershire, from Mid Wales, from Lisbon, from Tukums, Latvia, as well as, of course, from Slovenia. I will focus on public procurement in the schools, but we will see many different, I think, approaches, problems, challenges, as well as benefits and opportunities. My suggestion is that I will start with an overview of the status, let's say, and opportunities of public procurement in sustainable food systems. Then I will present the example from Slovenia, and we'll have the other examples. And at the end, we will follow with a half an hour of a discussion and wrap up. Each presentation of the example will take about 10 minutes, and we'll have just 5 minutes for quick questions. And I suggest just to focus then on maybe technical questions or really to the point, and then discuss broader questions or overlapping issues at the end. So basically, the idea when organizing this webinar was to kind of present a bit of a brief overview of the current situation of public procurement of food in European Union, and then together explore the potential, see the opportunity, the differences, the opportunities in how the public procurement can be used for improved sustainability of food systems and food supply chains. Any questions or comments? No? Okay, I'll share now my screen with the presentation. Okay. So, I just briefly go over the current status of public procurement of food. Basically, all the contracting authorities, these are all the bodies that are bound by, that have the status that are bound by the public procurement law, have to provide public procurement for supplies and services. And food is quite a large, let's say, part of public procurement. Why it is interesting for our community of practice, because through public procurement, all the public authorities can significantly influence the sustainability of food supply chain and various other synergies, including public health effect, because very often the public procurement of food is involved in procurement of food in schools, catering for the elderly, procurement in hospitals, and so on, catering to the vulnerable groups, etc. There is an estimate in a study done in 2017 that the European social food service market is larger than 80 billion euro. So in this estimate, only 15 countries, 15 largest countries were included. And just these 15 countries, which represent 88% of the total market in the EU, is 82 billion. So we can imagine total number could be something around 100 billion euros. And in these 15 countries, there are 18.5 billion meals provided annually. So it's a huge number, huge potential. So we have, I just wanted to give these numbers to have a kind of a picture. Mostly meal preparation and catering that is subject of public procurement is a mixture of public and private providers in different countries. It really depends on the structure, on the policy, and so on. So countries can have a variety of this. For example, in Slovenia, 95% of schools, kindergartens are public. So it's mostly, and the procurement of meals there is mostly done by their own kitchens, by their own staff internally. So public providers. But we have quite a strong pressure from private providers, because this is quite a lucrative market. We can imagine by the numbers on EU level, even in small countries like Slovenia, this is very interesting market for private catering services. Comparison between the countries shows that there are very different rules of public procurement. The implementation can be also very dispersed. You know, you have implementation on local level, on national level, within different institutions that are subject to the public procurement law and so on. And one of the main issues is that often the price of the service of the procurement of food is the only criterion. Often also the procurement rules are quite rigid, so they represent a certain administrative burden. If we talk about the challenges for use of public procurement for sourcing sustainably produced food, there are, of course, numerous cultural aspects. There's maybe higher or lower awareness or value given to quality of food versus, say, quantity. There's maybe a different value assigned to environmental sustainability. And there are, of course, also taste preferences. Some people, in some countries, there's higher value in, let's say, local food or kind of traditional food, while on the other hand, there can be a more demand for diversity. Quality of food procured through public procurement is quite an issue. There are quality standards regarding, let's say, health, of course, but how to assess the quality in terms of sustainability. There can be quality schemes that can be used, for example, organic labeling of organic food and so on, but also some other approaches. We talked in the previous webinar about participatory guarantee systems. These are maybe, this is maybe one approach that can be considered. Then there's the issue also of accounting for environmental impact. So how do you account as a criterion, what is the environmental impact of the food procured through your, I don't know, public tender? What is the transport aspect, transport cost, storage aspects, the energy demand for the food procured, and so on. And sometimes you have also the issue of matching supply and demand. I will talk about this. I'll give you an example for Slovenia later. I can just say that what I have seen, for example, for school meals, there's really big diversity in terms of what is the demand, because in some countries schools don't provide meals, children just bring them with them, while in the other countries might be mostly, I don't know, provided in schools by schools themselves, like in Slovenia. Also, there's an issue, I'll talk about this later also with the case of Ljubljana urban region, that in case when you have small scale mixed farming, you have a problem on the demand side because small farms simply cannot sometimes provide enough of produce that is in high demand. So they cannot match the criteria. And then there is a concept of local, concept that we discussed with Bryony, let's say, through emails and so on, that when we are looking to procure sustainably produced food, we are looking to locally produced food in order to reduce food miles, but there's a question of what is local. Is it from the same town or area, same municipality, same region? Then there's a diversity of size of the region. You know, Slovenia as a country is the size of, let's say, average region in the bigger EU member states. So you have the variety of this as well. Where's the potential of using public procurement for sustainability of food supply? Well, of course, there are the criteria related to quality and environmental impact, additional to the food, just the price. There's also the potential for cooperation between sectors for synergies. For example, there's a strong link to public health and social issues because publicly procured food is usually for schools, for example, food banks, for nursing homes, hospitals, etc. Then there's also the farming policy that needs to support, let's say, sustainable food production, including quality schemes. And then there's the public administration aspect. How do you manage public procurement? Can you maybe team up, pull together the resources? Can you exchange the experience, etc.? And there's variety of institutions that participate. It really depends on the country, as we talked earlier. And there's opportunity to introduce some innovative approaches. I'm sure Dan will have some examples about that. And I would be happy to hear if there's maybe an inspiration from the COVID-19 response to the situation. For example, in Slovenia, we really saw a spike in demand of locally produced food. Okay, there was a decrease in demand in terms of school meals because schools were closed, but basically the food supply focused on quite heavily on local resources. So I'm counting on the feedback from you. Any questions or comments? I would suggest that then I continue with the example from Slovenia. I would like to present the procurement of local food in schools and kindergartens. Just for a bit of background, we have just to understand the context of kindergartens and schools in Slovenia. This is largely, I think, the inheritance of the past system, that almost all schools and kindergartens are public. Like I can say almost 99%. There are mandatory school meals. So schools and kindergartens have to provide a snack and a lunch each day. Some provide even more if they have some sort of extended teaching and so on in the afternoon and so on. So most of the schools are equipped with kitchens. And this is an area that's heavily regulated. We have a school nutrition law. Each school has to have a food officer who is in charge of the diet, the menu, the quality, etc. The drawback is that there are increasingly demanding standards in terms of workload. So the kitchen staff there's less and less kitchen staff with more and more tasks to do and taking care of the quality as well. And it's important also to know that some schools and kindergartens provide also some takeaway lunches to external clients. These are mostly retirees who can come and pick it up. It's kind of like Meals on Wheels, but with own pickup, let's say. And it's interesting that some schools decided to outsource to large catering companies the lunches, but they're increasingly going back because with their own kitchens, they have more control over the quality. And the trend, just to mention the trend, there's an increasing number of, let's say, picky eaters, so kids who don't want to eat at school, and dietary restrictions. It's notable also that the meals are subsidized, and there's also additional subsidy for vulnerable groups. So in addition to this, many schools also, although they are public, they want to really promote themselves. They join many different initiatives like healthy schools, eco schools. They have school eco gardens, etc. Just as an example, I can show you here. It's small print, I know, but this is an example of the menu that's published on the website of a school that Yuri attended, for example. We are cooperating with that school. So we have the menu for next week when the schools will be reopened on Monday. So we have the allergen list and then the menu for breakfast, snack, lunch, afternoon snack for those kids who stay on in the afternoon. So all kind of clearly published, visible, and so on. So now to the core of the story, the public procurement rules. We have a quite strict law on public procurement where the focus is on price. However, some sets, let's say some group foods, can be excluded from this, provided that their value is lower than 80,000 euro per year, and that overall value is less than 20% of the total value of all the food procurement. So basically, the schools can have this 20% exemption for the food sets that they want to procure, let's say, with additional criterion. So these additional criterion are quality schemes. So, for example, they can look for organic food. Then the compliance with national food quality regulations, and then the sustainably produced food with freshness and lower transport environmental impact, which means local and seasonal food. So apples in the autumn, grapes in the autumn, not in the spring from Chile, for example, and so on. Strawberries only in May and June, not in, I don't know, December from Southern Hemisphere, and so on. Any school that wants to enter this system needs to make a market analysis, which is strongly facilitated by the so-called food catalog for public procurement of food that was set up by the Chamber of Agri-Food Companies, where you can look up, for example, for dairy, for the prices, for the providers, for different types of fruits, for different types of meats. So, and this is also a tool that enables schools to basically make the market analysis, like pull the information and set it up and contact the suppliers and publish the tender. The tenders go out then for the selected food categories that school selected to be the exemption for this kind of price criterion. And usually there's just the time period that is for the validity. This is usually 3 months, just because, you know, there's quite a fluctuation in prices. Producers also don't like longer periods, because this is the period when they have to guarantee the price that they bid with. So, you know, it's not favorable to have long period if the price is on the market is increasing and you are then underselling to a school. Here's just an image from the catalog, this web-based tool, where you just register if you're a public institution, or you register if you are a supplier, and then you enter, you can have all this selection and so on. I'll just briefly talk about the example of Ljubljana urban region, just to see the scale. There's an estimated 100 to 120 schools and kindergartens that use this approach of using this 20% exemption. And they largely share their knowledge and experience. You know, the headmasters and the food officers exchange their experience, tips and tricks, especially with the administration. And the key driver is the municipality of Ljubljana, which has 70 schools and kindergartens that participate in this scheme. And the strong point is that the city council provides administrative support. So they have a branch which handles public procurement for those schools that want to. So 80% of these 70 schools, they kind of, let's say, outsource the handling of the procurement to the city council. What is mostly purchased, it's usually staple fruits like apples and other fruits, potato, let's say eggs, flour, but also honey and quite a lot of dairy products, and as well as some other products like pasta and meat. The problem is that if you buy meat through this scheme, it's quite expensive compared to others. You can basically spend the whole 20% for maybe 2 lunches, 2 meat-based lunches, instead of having a month supply of fruit or month supply of potatoes. So the food officers usually balance this. And from what we gathered from food officers, most food producers are from the region, but there's also seasonal variation in quantity. So maybe sometimes they need to outsource from other regions, especially from the coastal, which has better climate and earlier products or longer growing period and so on. And it's important to know that organic food is mostly important, because the local supply is just not enough, not even in Slovenia. So it's mostly important from, I don't know, Italy, Spain, and so on. If we have a look at the successful aspects of this approach, this really shortened food supply chain. It was estimated by a study in 2016 that the locally produced food, its share increased for 60% in public procurement since 2012, that the quality improved. This is the opinion of food officers that we talked to. There's also better satisfaction and trust of parents. And some schools and kindergartens use this approach also for discussing the food supply issues, for teaching, like farm to fork concept and so on. Because there's considerable administrative burden with bidding process, some farmers associations are stepping up and supporting their members with filling out the applications and administration and so on. And it shows that it turns out that contributing to this selling the produce through public procurement in this way actually stabilized the farmers' earnings, because they may not be earning as much as if they were bidding all the time on the market, but their earning is more reliable. And they establish trusted relationships, and the schools often work mostly with the same farmers. Let's say they buy apples always from the same farmer, or eggs or meat or honey and so on. There's a significant impact on public health, especially for children from vulnerable groups, and indirectly also to retirees, to elderly people, because of this takeaway scheme. So overall, this is an important, let's say, synergy, let's say. What are the challenges? Well, there's the challenge how to balance this cost and effect of this 20%. As I mentioned, the food officers have to decide whether to buy meat, which is expensive, for example, or more fruit, or more expensive dairy products, like some types of yogurt compared to just milk, and so on. There's a bottleneck in terms of experience and availability of food officers. These are mostly biology or chemistry teachers who may already have a very full schedule, so they're more maybe not so much dedicated to, you know, setting up the menu and taking care of the diet and getting into the whole public procurement administration. So there's this is also because there's high administrative burden on both sides. The farmers also complain that they would participate, but there's a lot of paperwork to do. And especially because we have a lot of mixed farms, they have to bid for example, different lots if they have different types of food. So one lot for fruits, one lot for vegetables, so double the administration. There's the issue of local, as I pointed out, and the quality. There are some distributors that also bid for these public procurement calls, and they guarantee the delivery, but it's not necessarily local. So Ljubljana schools may be purchasing, I don't know, fruits not from Ljubljana region, but from, say, East, Murska Sobota, and so on. There's the question, what is local? Is it local enough, you know, in the kind of broader EU perspective? There's the issue of seasonality that I already mentioned, and the issue of free movement of goods, which is one of the EU, let's say, basic rules. And quite sometimes, depending on the season, it happens that the supply does not meet the demand. Sometimes, you know, the year is good for fruits, sometimes not, and so on. So there's a question about that. And organic produce, we don't have many certified producers, so it's mostly important. In Ljubljana urban region, there's also the case that in case more schools, more public institutions participate, there might be strong competition between the public institutions for those farmers who are participating, who are willing. So the demand will be much larger than supply. So, and just to wrap up, what is the potential for the expansion of this approach? There could be expansion to high schools and universities. They don't really provide the food, but sometimes they have this kind of catering, like cafeteria, by private contractors. There are the elderly care homes, hospitals, which are currently not very active in this approach. How to expand this and improve the organization and governance of the public food procurement? The scheme could definitely be simplified to ease this administrative burden. Maybe there could be a kind of a joint body for public procurement of food also in other municipalities. Like the Ljubljana example, there could be better coordination with various stakeholders for additional effects and synergies. And although this food catalog is very, very good information source, there could be maybe some improved information on supply side, so that, for example, schools would know in advance for their usual suppliers what is this year's kind of prospect for supply and so on. And then, of course, more innovative approaches, some introducing of dynamic procurement system. As far as I know, they're already looking into this, but this would have to you know, this means also considerable changes of rules. So it will take a while. Yeah. So this was a wrap up of presentation of Slovene example. Are there any questions or comments?
There were several.
Okay.
So there was a nice discussion in the chat about the impact of COVID-19 on guaranteed meals for children. So a lot of children relied on these meals during the day. And so how do you continue to give that to the children while the schools are not in session? But more relevant to your specific presentation was a question from Paula Rodriguez. And maybe Paula, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question. Paula?
Hello. Good
Hello.
morning.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, good morning.
Thank you, Monica, so much for your presentation. It was very interesting to listen. In fact, we in our territory we have almost the same situation as you presented. This is why when you talk about the seasonality of the products, I ask myself, how can you choose several suppliers for the same lot? So let me explain. I understood that because in some times of the year you do not have the enough quantity of products for the major supply from who you buy the products. So you are going to buy to another ones which are not so local. So in terms of public tender, how can you have more than one supplier for a lot category? For example, we have one supplier for organic vegetables. It's not allowed for us to have two suppliers for this type of product. So how can you do it in terms of public procurement?
Yeah, interesting question. The simplest thing actually is to buy from a distributor, and then you are covered. You know, you want to have a certain set of foods, and this supplier bids and distributor bids and provides everything, and he pulls the resources from different farmers.
Yeah, it's not the case.
Yeah,
yes.
or you can bid. What happens in the school that we studied, this Preseria school that I showed you the menu, they, for example, for apples, they took on a couple of farmers because each of them, they had similar price, basically the same, but one of them could not supply all, you know, could not provide all the quantity. So they took 2 or 3, depending on the year.
Yes, so, but to do that, they have to buy to a group of suppliers, a group of farmers. So one single entity who manage these all farmers of apples.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Here the associations stepped in.
Yes.
So, for example, the Association of Organic Fruit Producers.
Yeah. Yes.
They are doing all the administration and bidding for their members, and then they agree. You know, they pull together the resources.
We do not have that kind of reality in terms of organic in our territory, and we only buy local. So for us, it's not possible to do this. And at the present time, we have a specific farmer of organic vegetables. And of course that we want them to manage themselves and reunite themselves in the terms of an association, but this not depend on us. So it's depending on the will of the farmers to promote a local association. So this is why I was asking, how could you manage with several suppliers? And you ask, as I already thought about, and it's not possible in our reality. But thank you so much for your explanation.
Yeah, you're welcome. Maybe just a comment on, I saw that there was a question of price and covering the costs. The subsidies are provided by the municipalities. And well, the higher cost for local food is just kind of counted in the price of the meals. So, and because of the large extent of subsidy, snacks are subsidized 60% and lunch is 28%. the parents don't really mind because the costs are minor, let's say, the parents of the kids. So, okay, I think it's time to move on to Dan. We'll have, I guess, the other discussion, I mean, the more questions at the end. So, Dan, I'm handing over to you.
Thanks, Moika. That was a fantastic introduction. And I'll just get my slides up. Can everyone see them?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. No, that's great. Thanks so much, Moika. That really set the scene, and also had so many different angles to it, I think. I'm going to try and some of the context behind procurement in Britain, even with Brexit, are very, very similar to the ones you outlined. So I won't go over the technicalities of the procurement system so much in Britain. I think what I'm going to do, and I've only got 4 slides, so hopefully it won't be long. I'm going to just describe how the food system for schools, only schools, operates at the moment in the county of Gloucestershire. And then I'm going to talk about the kind of work we've been trying to achieve through our living lab. Then I'm going to talk about a concept called anchor institutes, which we're thinking about in terms of driving regional economic growth through sort of civic investment, including public procurement. And then I'll just make some reflections on how this is going and make a brief mention at the end, only briefly, about potentials for working across administrative boundaries. In our case, that would hopefully be with Monmouthshire, and Bryony can talk more about that later. So let me just see if I can. There we are. That's better. So just very quickly, unlike Moitza's introduction, in Britain, it's no longer compulsory for local authorities to offer school meals to their schools. But in 2014, a political decision was made when those rules were changed by the County Council of Gloucestershire. So GCC is Gloucestershire County Council. A political decision was made then to continue to supply school meals, really for health-based reasons. So since then, the council, GCC, has contracted out its school food catering service to a commercial company which is called Caterlink. And Caterlink is really a pretty large but subnational catering company. And because of the outsourcing issue, it now means that Caterlink are in charge of the whole school meal system. The county council does nothing really apart from, well, it runs the schools, of course, but it only, in terms of feeding the children, it only issues the contract to Caterlink. So that means that all of the cooks, 500 of them in the case of Gloucestershire, are employed by this company, Caterlink, which also sources all the food and employs and trains all the chefs, and owns all the kitchen equipment as well, I must say. Now, by and large, we would reflect that this is a very good system. It works well, and you can see further down that they're feeding a great number of children every day. 18,500 meals a day are supplied without fail. And Gloucestershire's got a long history of being quite closely interested in food qualities, with a plural, and they've hooked up to this scheme in Britain that we have called Food for Life. It's run by an organisation called the Soil Association, which is an organic agriculture NGO really, but they've developed this voluntary industry mark called Food for Life, and it has gold, silver and bronze, and Gloucestershire's got silver. So it means that it's putting some efforts into local sourcing, and that's been written into the contract which Caterlink have to then consider. So I said that 18,500 meals are supplied daily. about 80% of the primary schools, not secondary. Most secondaries do their own thing, but that's another story. We can come back to that if you want. About 80% of primary schools use the council facilitated service. And so the other 20% will make their own arrangements. Of those schools, about half, just over half, have production kitchens. And so what Caterlink are able to organize is that production kitchens can supply neighboring schools where they have no kitchens. You can see that the meal budget is around £2.30 a head. What's that, about 250, 260 euros per child? And that's the money that the council are given by the national government to supply a two-course meal per child. So this is the existing arrangement, and the new contract will be issued next July. And what we've been doing with the County Council is to think about two things. One is, can we increase the range and the scale of regional farmers who are supplying into this contract through a new system called dynamic procurement system, and I'll come on to that just in a second. But through the Living Lab, what we're doing is to work with a couple of farmers groups to do a trial. We haven't achieved this yet, but we're on the brink of doing farmer-based workshops with 2 farmer networks in the county to do a trial for meat and vegetable supplies using this dynamic procurement system, which I'll now describe. So one policy context is that the UK Treasury, the Finance Ministry, has recently introduced a policy in recognition of the importance of the public purse, as Moitza was suggesting early on, to try and get as much of its public needs from small and medium-sized enterprises, not just from big corporations. So that's been a very major driver in current thinking around public procurement in Britain. And rather, as we were hearing from Ljubljana and Maria Jose in the past, you've written some emails around about the situation in Lisbon, and it's, I'm sure, a similar one here. Usually smaller local producers have found it pretty hard work to get into procurement contracts because of the system of lots, because of the issues around reliability and seasonality, schools being on holiday when the best productive time is. All of these issues have made it quite difficult and a real pain administratively for smaller people to get involved. So the DPS, the Dynamic Procurement System, is a relatively new IT-based solution that was really initiated in the retail sector, the private retail sector. But what it does is to find a range of suppliers of all sorts of different sizes and consolidates knowledge about what food is available from them collectively. And this is all done through an algorithm managed internet facility, which is highly complex, but is successful. So basically what you have is a move away from this issue of lots and simply a consolidation of all available supplies on a, get this, daily basis, because the farmers are hooked up to the system and are able to report their daily availability. Now that is all consolidated through the internet platform and presented to the buyers, who in this case are the school cooks. So what the school cook sees every day is one set of availabilities for, let's say, carrots. So the school cooks can see that there is an availability of maybe carrots or maybe organic carrots, and each will have a price per kilo. There's no information about who that's from. There's no information about, what the price was today or yesterday. It's always changing. And there's no information about anything really. So apart from the fact that these carrots are available and how much they cost. So this is a really fantastic way of consolidating supply. It still pre-requires farmers to be compliant with the public system. We were hearing about that earlier. But once they are compliant, they're in the system and they can present produce that they have available every day. And if there's no produce available, then they simply won't enter it. that doesn't concern the cooks. And it means, we hope, that a really big range of farmers, both big ones and small ones, can dip in and out of the DPS system whenever they like. It's also good because it doesn't compete necessarily with the big businesses, where we've seen that DPS retains business with the big companies for dry goods, for example, and pasta and frozen goods, for example, but more fresh produce can come through the DPS system. Okay, so just in case you wanted to look it up yourself, there's this company, Fresh Range, who are based in Keynsham, very near Bristol. They piloted this system both in retail, but later on with BAINS, that's the acronym for Bath and North East Somerset Council. They did a trial with that council, supplying 60 schools from 20 producers. And there's a written up study that I can send any of you if you want, that evaluated that study. Now, what we want to do in Gloucestershire is to copy that, but scale it up, because we've got 190 schools, not 60. And also, at the same time, CCS, that's a Crown Commercial Services organisation. That's a national government procurement agency. They want to trial DPS across the whole of the southwest of England next year in all sectors, health, etc. So what we would like to do is to get the new contract for Gloucestershire to ensure that DPS is part of the sourcing opportunity, and that then the County Council School Meal Service joins the regional DPS trial across all of the public sector. So basically, that's my story. Let me just say one last thing. We're very interested at the moment in anchor institutes. And anchor institutes are sort of big institutions that are locally anchored. You know, they're hospitals, and this is Gloucester Hospital in the top, and Shire Hall, whoever among you know Carey Stevens, that's where she works, that grand place with the pillars. These institutions have a lot of employees, they own big assets, and they're not mobile. So there's a lot of talk about how anchor institutes can really invest in economic growth through the buying of more local services. And in our case, of course, this could include food. And I've put in a link there to a very nice case study for Preston Borough Council. Preston's a pretty poor city in the northwest of England, and they've used this issue of anchor institutes, cross-sectoral governance and local purchasing to really make a difference to growth and job creation, which are, of course, the key points of interest for us in Robust. So just some last reflections, and I won't go through them all. You'll have all this later on, but I just wanted to highlight two. One is that in all of this aspiration that I've shared with you, we recognize that the contracted out service with Caterlink, the private company, works very well. And this is a difficult thing for us to negotiate in some ways through the Living Lab, because the DPS would create a competition with an existing good service. I suppose the key thing would be, how can we make sure Caterlink adopts DPS? So on the reflective side, what we know is that Caterlink try very hard to get local food into the school meal system, but they are reliant on local suppliers. And if the local suppliers have the same problems that we've been hearing about all morning, then that's limited. And then there's that last issue there at the bottom about anchor institutes potentially being a key to driving local economic development and well-being through the public purse. But of course, the reflection on that is that it's massively complicated. It's taken Preston about 8 years to get this working, and it speaks to all the things we're interested in Robust, like multi-level governance, multi-sectoral cooperation, and the quadruple helix and all those headaches. So I'll leave it there and be happy to answer any questions if you like. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Dan. You have two questions. Let's take the first one from Anda, which she had a question about the DPS relating to a notion of trust. Do you want to take your mic off and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Dan. I was just wondering, the DPS system sounds like you said that it might be a very functional one, but I was just wondering, where does the concept of trust links into that? Because as far as at least theoretically we know that supplies from small-scale providers are also frequently based on personal relations and trust in the produce that they supply. And if you say that it's only the cost and availability that is present there as criteria, where is the guarantee of quality that is based on previous experience there? Thanks.
That's a really good question. Thanks, Anda. Well, there's two things to say. One is that in the past, experience of using local suppliers has not worked. So, you know, the scale is simply too big, and all of the logistical nightmares that we've been hearing about so far this morning have proved, at least in Britain, that local food suppliers find it really, really hard to get into the system. And Gloucestershire Council, our partners, have tried to do this for other industries, for example, building, and found it really, really difficult. So I think the first thing to say is that this whole system is based around the idea that it's possible and efficient and operable to hook up local suppliers. But I do know what you're driving at, and don't forget that the County Council is running a public service. It's made a political decision to run this service on the basis of child health. And I think, you know, the adherence to voluntary measures like Food for Life is a reassurance to people. There's another thing as well that is in operation now in Britain widely, although it's not compulsory, I must say, called the Balanced Scorecard. So, and this relates back to what we were hearing from Ljubljana earlier on. The Balanced Scorecard enables people not just to take the smallest price, although in practice that still does happen quite often, but to make a balanced assessment of various qualities. And local authorities are empowered to do that. So I think the anonymity of the DPS system isn't so much that you can't find out who's in there. You absolutely can. But what you're doing every day as a buyer, maybe, is you're looking at what carrots or what potatoes or what meat and bread is available, and you'll see the product there in front of you. If you want to, you can follow that through. There isn't anonymity if you want to follow it through. People are profiled on the system. The main thing I wanted to emphasize was that cooks don't have to have this sort of balancing act every day. You know, do I spend more on organic or do I spend more on local? They'll have that choice for organic or not organic, but they won't be presented with a choice between a very cheap carrot that's come from a wholesaler that's national, or let's say an expensive carrot that's come from someone. All farmers who supply have to become compliant before they're allowed onto the DPS. So that means they have to be you know, viable as a business. They have to have public liability insurance. They have to have good ethical practices and employment practices. You know, they will probably need to prove what kind of environmental arrangements they're engaged in as farmers. All of these things can be woven into the contract that the local authority sets. I hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Great. Francesca, you had a question for Dan.
Yes, thanks, Dan. And it was nice to hear more about dynamic procurement systems, because I could never understand what they were about. And I did some work on public procurement a few years ago, and I clearly remember speaking to a public officer for school meals, and she was telling me that, okay, you said that in this system, you see on a daily basis what quantities and prices are available for specific references. And I remember her words saying that it's not so easy to adapt to changes in terms of supplies, both for health reasons, because there is a specific balance across different elements of the meals. So if you change carrots with spinach, it's not the same thing on a health ground. And on the other side, the relationship with parents, who may not be so careful with the children's choice at home, but they're very, very picky. Happen in schools, at least in Italy. So if the menu is not the same as what it was planned, they receive complaints. So I see clearly the benefits for farmers and the consolidation of supply side, but I was curious to hear more about what happens on the demand side, both for the nutritional balance of meals and the relationship with parents, if you have information on this. Thanks.
Yeah, I have. And in brief, I'm happy to talk at greater length about any of these issues later on if you like, but in brief, there's a few things there. So on substitution of ingredients, I think two things. One is the substitution of one supply of carrots for another supply. You know, the DPS proposes that people dip in and dip out when they can. So if there's a time when farmer A can't supply carrots, then farmer B may be able to, or it could be that when it's not the carrot season, the big national wholesaler has to step in with imported carrots. So the whole system is designed to be flexible enough to cover different types of scale so that the provision of produce is not compromised through changes in seasonality, but actually brings in seasonality when that's possible. The second thing is in terms of parents, this will change from local authority to local authority in England, but this issue of being involved with the scheme called Food for Life, silver level Food for Life, which of course is the middle of the three, involves consultation with parents in menu setting. Menus are set on a rotation every 7 weeks. They change in Gloucestershire, but menus will be developed in consultation with parents. Now, part of that is structural because Caterlink, the private company in Gloucestershire, employs lots of people as kitchen staff, and we can imagine that kitchen staff may well be taken from the local community. Many of the kitchen staff are usually mothers who are part-time because it fits in with the working day and the school day. So there's a huge degree of community involvement by hook or by crook, either by kind of NGO design or by structural accident in menu design.
Great. Dan, you have one more question from Mark. Mark, would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
Sure. I think you slightly answered it already, actually, Dan. Thank you very much for that, by the way. It was a very interesting case study and presentation. But I'm just, you mentioned in the final slide a reflection on the issue of reliability. And I was just wondering if you could expand a bit more upon that, because I'm kind of interested in the role and the dynamic for how the wholesaler, if you like, the big company that sort of requires volume in order to continue to be viable. How does that fit into this relationship? Is this about prioritizing the small scale producer and they provide the majority of what's in season? Or is ultimately the wholesaler still the bulk provider of the resources that the kitchens and so on use? So how do they deal with that reliability issue?
I think I don't know the answer to that, Mark. It's a good question, but I think what I can maybe reflect is, number one, the whole of this is being trialled. It's only been done in relatively small local authorities, and this big scale rollout across the whole Southwest region is something that's going to, you know, will have taken 2 to 3 years to work out. And I've seen some of the logistical and structural arrangements, and I can't really understand them because I'm not in wholesaling. I think the issue is really more flexible than the situation that you've been worrying about. Maybe it's so the thing to emphasize, I think, is that any supplier at all of any scale has to be pre-compliant with local authority procurement. That's a given, and everybody has to do that. I think if farmers who are small and who are doing this as a trial, maybe, and there's a lot of talk about this as a possible post-COVID agricultural recovery strategy at the moment, as you'll know. I think if farmers simply feel that they can't be bothered, or they have a different market somewhere else that seems to be more lucrative than the school one, there is that flexibility to just stop supplying. Once you're compliant, it's up to you. You know, it may be that your level of supply is not consistent. So that's a different matter from reliability, because the system as a whole ensures a reliable quantity of supply. But the details of that are still being worked out and ironed out. And the trial for the Southwest region, if you remember, the Bath pilot that I showed had 20 farmers involved in supplying 60 schools. We're talking about the whole public sector, the army, prisons, hospitals, and there would be at least 400 local suppliers across the Southwest region. So some of this is beyond my understanding, but I hope I've given some indication of what's going on.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. That's really helpful. Thanks.
Okay, I think it's time to move on. We'll have Desiree from Mid Wales. She's just not available at the moment. She'll be back. She had to leave briefly. So I would ask Maria from Lisbon if you could present. Would that be okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh.
And I guess there will be a lot of similar topics.
Some problem. Yes, some problem. Are you seeing me? No.
Yes, we see you.
But I don't see you.
Okay.
I don't know why. Okay. Okay. Are you seeing me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Are you sharing your screen?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem.
Because I was something happened with Zoom that I don't know what happened with Zoom, but I'm trying to. Oh, okay.
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 Excellent.
Okay. Okay.
Will you manage to?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
That's okay? No?
Yeah, great.
Okay. So I'll be, it's a short presentation. Focus on the public procurement process. To focus on the problem that it's not like in Slovenian situation, because first of all, why are we interested in the issue? Because in the context of LL living level, Lisbon living level, we choose proximity territorial economy as the main issue for the labor living, and in that context, we choose to study or to the program, the sustainable school food program as one of the topics for this living level. So, and it is a very good point because the Lisbon region, it has a urban area, but it's surrounding with agriculture area. So you can provide the supply canteens and with products from this area, because we have a very large agriculture area surrounding the urban cities and towns in this in Lisbon metropolitan area. But and we formed a team and group last February to deal with this topic, sustainable food school food program. Focus on the kindergarten and primary school managed by municipalities. The focus, the objective was to establish a healthier and more sustainable school food system. And in the topics we are intend to deal with, one of them is how local governments can use public procurement to promote local food, not branching the EU legislation. That's why you are intending to know how to achieve this objective. Now I'm focusing in the main characteristics of the Public Procurement Act in the Portuguese Public Procurement Act. What is the main point? That it's not favorable for school meals, school canteens to be supplied by local food and by farmers and local food. And the two main problems in this field, public procurement rule, it's in these two points. First of all, the division in lots does not benefit SMEs, small and medium enterprises, because we only have to, it's only mandatory to divide into lots when the tender is up this value. If this is, it is not, if it is not above this value, so you can't, it is not mandatory to divide it in lots. The second issue, it's about the qualitative award criteria, because it is not mandatory. The award criteria tender depends on, can be awarded according to two criteria. Best value for money, and this is situational. You need to have quality criteria to tender, to award the tender, but you can choose only the price as the sole criteria. This is it's for my reason, for my point of view, it's a very restriction to more sustainable and healthier meals, because you can only use price to choose tender. The other point, it's regarding quality criteria for valuing quality and sustainability of foodstuffs. You don't have any specific qualitative criteria, unlike civilian Slovenia, to choose tender in regarding qualitative and environmental criteria. So for me, it's the two main problems, that they are not good, they are not effective, and prevent SMEs and small companies to be involved in tender procedures. Second, green public procurement guidance. For the first time since last year, we have the green public procurement guidance. Before, you haven't this kind of, you don't use green procurement as a criteria to award tenders. This guidance, it's based on EU Green Public Procurement Criteria for Food document, and this, it has some difference because you can consider short food supply chains as a word criterion only for food procurement, not for catering procurement. I don't know why, but this is something different from the anterior period, because now you have, for the first time, a document, a guidance for green public procurement for food. And this is quite different from the past. And in the last 2 years, we have some recent political action to make school food healthier and more sustainable. Three kind of type of actions. First of all, the guidance for menus and the nutritional quality. In 2018, it was published this guidelines on school menus and canteens that enforce this quality of menus and nutritional quality of meals. And in 2017, we went for a law for that became mandatory the vegetarian option in menus of public canteens. In another field, organic food, regarding organic food, since last year, we have a pilot on biological canteens schema certification that canteens can join, and this is it is according the percentage, the share of organic ingredients of the menu that are used in the menu. And and nowadays you have a law, for the first time you have a law that promoting sustainable and quality local food consumption in public canteens. It is focus on quality. It focuses on local food and in environmental issues as transport implication and so on. So in our days we have for the first time some rules and policies that can improve sustainability and quality in school canteens. This is an improvement. very important improvement. And only for you have an idea how is processed in Lisbon region, the procurement for food school supply. This table shows that in the most situation, the tender awarded is awarded in the basis of catering services, based on only on price. And these catering services are from a very large commercial enterprises, companies. And only a few municipalities have some criterion for quality. And just one, it's a little one, as a direct management for supply canteens. So this is the situation. Only the most important way for food school award tender award is to canteen services is in direct management, mainly based on price. And local food and environmental issues are not present in most tender procedures. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Thank you very much. Indeed, quite a different situation.
Yes.
From Slovenia.
Yes, yes.
I would suggest that we go on with the presentations because we are a bit late. So, and then have questions in the end because they will probably overlap as well. So I would like to ask the Tukums team to take over.
Just a moment, Artur, should I show the presentation or will you show the presentation?
Yes, please, Mitels, if you can.
Definitely can.
Okay, great.
Do you see the presentation?
Yes, excellent.
Great. So Artur, if you could start, please.
Okay. Yes, now I see it. Okay, so hello everyone, and yes, me and Mitels will try to tell briefly about situation in Latvia and also in Tukums. And yes, Mitels, can you please go to the next slide? Yes, so very briefly about the actual situation in Tukums and the green public procurement. As you see, the one important thing is that actually the decision was made for most of our schools and kindergartens to outsource the catering service, and the agreement was made for 5 years period from 2016 to 2021, and now only for 2 institutions we are making the public procurement for food only. So it is for the Tukums High School and Special Educational Institution of Tukums County. Yes, and of course it not gives the contract which is signed with the public caterer does not give us very so good options to contract. However, it states that he should. I don't think we're really using this very much. So yes, we are using the criteria which is we can use due to green public procurement procedure. And as you see, what is interesting, the price makes only 30% of all the maximum points. The quality criteria, which means you have to have like labels of National Food Quality System, biological quality labels or others, makes the most of the value, which is 40 points. The environmentally friendly transport makes 20 points, which is the best option for local producers to get the best score. And environmentally friendly management of packaging is valued by 10% of the points. From this, it looks very well, and it seems like there's good options for our local producers. But okay, let's move to the next slide, please. So what is the actual success of our procurement system? Both of procurements are divided into lots, 11 for ice hall and 5 for special educational institution. And the lots are quite small, narrow, and that they give a good option for local producer, as it seems. For example, it's divided into meat, chicken meat, bread, confectionery, milk products, eggs, and other lots are more wider and more easily can be supported by big wholesalers or suppliers. But actually, for the last procurement, which was for this year, as I tried to check all our companies that applied, only one local wholesaler applied, and actually none of our local producers and food processors or farmers applied, really, which was quite a surprise for me. And I checked that I know that one of our local meat producers applied a few years ago, and I had a brief talk with him. And actually, what was also interesting, but not very surprising, he lost due to the points in the section of quality section, which is 40%. And he really perceived that he lost because of the better pricing of the big companies, but actually that was not the case. So my brief conclusions were, first of all, better communication has to be done with our local producers, and I thought our members of our council are really communicating with them, but actually, as it seems, not so much. So we have to sit down with all our local suppliers, which we know, and we know that they can support those lots, and how to describe the system, describe the evaluation, the importance of quality certificates, which can be crucial. And of course, this is a big question also, if they are able and they have the staff to apply and do all the paperwork for this public procurement system. which is a good question also, and we have to talk with them and understand what's the situation and can we help somehow. And also, yes, the one problem I think is that we have the biggest portion of our kindergartens and schools are in public, are catering outsourcing. That makes our lots are not so big in the amount of money, and it might be not so interesting for for example, our local food processor to do all the paperwork for this amount of money. For example, for meat products, this year the total sum of the lot was about 20,000 euros. And this is question, is this sum interesting for one of our companies to do all the paperwork, to understand how it works, how to apply from procurement? If the company isn't already doing it in some other municipalities or some other procurements, this is the big question. And yes, it's what I wanted to say. Now I would like to hand on to Michaelis for the situation state.
I will continue this presentation. I have taken a little bit different approach. I will try to illustrate what's happening in Latvia in terms of public procurement in general. Yet, since we have only 10 minutes, I will run over just a couple of facts. And if you have any more specific questions, please write them in the chat and I will try to answer them later on. So I would like to start with showing what has happened in Latvia during the last couple of years. And more precisely, what we can observe is that there has been centralization of school catering taking place. And if we regard numbers in 2012, and if we compile schools served by 5 major caterers, we see that these were 66 schools. And then in 2016, the 5 same caterers were operating in, I think, 125 schools. And this isn't necessarily good or bad, but it just illustrates a trend that there are growing these large nationwide caterers that quite often are incompatible with local procurement. Also, there has been some anecdotal evidence that these larger caterers produce more food waste, but this is still to be proven. But there are some researchers working on these questions. And partly this centralization has been related to peculiarities of national school system. We have a very high number of very small schools, which and municipalities are obliged to cater kids in these schools, yet there are often problems to ensure that private caterers are willing to get into these schools. So that I will show in a later slide how this affects the overall catering system. So, although we see this overall centralization, the funny thing is that the general discourse suggests that we should go into this local procurement more. And when we discuss these issues with local experts, they are saying that basically you regard regulations, how they are currently set in Latvia, everything is in place for municipality to introduce truly local public procurement. And basically, if municipality has the time, it could come up with very unique, well-embedded systems that would source local food. However, there are just a handful of examples where this is actually happening. And our research on the issue have revealed that there are 3 main reasons for that. And first of all, it is because in the description of legislation, there are still some holes that can be interpreted in various ways. So basically, for example, there is this idea that in order to prove that food is local or food is organic, you have to use labels. And there are a list of labels that you can use. But then, well, some of them have these very strict and rigid criteria that prove that the way how the product have been obtained Other are less strict and allow more interpretation within them. Also, municipalities, in municipalities, you can see that there are certain past dependencies. For example, if somebody has been operating in these schools for 10 years, for them it will be much more cheaper to apply for, to propose, or their proposal will be much more cheaper for the following term of procurement, covered by procurement. So although there are these criteria that could be interpreted as green, corresponding green public procurement, we see quite often that still the major criteria is price. Also, I think somebody else already mentioned that procurement is basically left on the shoulders of municipalities. And although they are interested to do the best job they can, they often lack the competencies, and also the persons who are interested to actually change something are very busy because they are engaged in basically everything that municipality is doing. And also municipality is partly a hostage because on the one hand, they have usually these very large schools where everybody would want to deliver food to kids, but then they have these really small schools where nobody applies. So what well, nobody's willing to supply food. So what they do is they bundle these schools together. And by doing so, they actually reduce the number of applications, yet they ensure that everybody receives at the end of school meals. And something else, yeah, and just a recent example, and that's I'm adding it here just because that's an interesting example. An effect of this centralization. Just last year, there was a food contamination scandal in Latvia, and because we have this data on how many which procurer feeds which school, we could calculate how many kids were exposed to this contaminated food. And it turned out that almost 20% of Latvia's school kids were exposed to this potentially harmful food. And this is an effect of centralization. And again, I'm not saying that centralized system is bad, it's just that it's often not properly evaluated and we don't see all the risks, yet we don't also see all the potential in that probably. And a couple of years ago, I think in 2016, Baltic Studies Center within the project of Transmango, we conducted 2 workshops with school food experts, and we asked them to discuss what would be the goals where Latvia should go in terms of principles, how kids are fed within school. And what I'm showing you at the moment are the results of this discussion. And as you see, the first, convincingly, the first principle is all products and all ingredients are produced by local producers. And so it's quite interesting that you see that the system is moving in one direction where everybody seems to be agreeing that it should move in another direction. And also in the same workshop, we asked the same experts, could they identify what are the current strengths of the system? And so this is just a list of what they identified as strength. And as you see, green public procurement is one of them, active youngsters. So there are quite a diversity of aspects that experts are perceiving as the strength of the system. And we have a good basis to do something. But then when it comes to how to act on these resources and how to use the systems that, according to experts, could be working, we are somewhere getting lost in the middle. So, yeah. If you have any questions, please ask.
I would actually suggest that we move to Midwell's presentation and then have questions in the end, because we're kind of running a bit late, and Desiree is back. So Desiree, I would hand it over to you.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, hi.
Hi. Sorry, I had to dip out earlier on.
No problem. Welcome back in our community.
Thank you.
I'm giving you the podium, and I just ask you to keep to 10 minutes time?
It's fine.
Okay, we'll have a discussion later. So
I haven't done a presentation. I'm simply going to talk about procurement, if that's okay, and where we're at. So almost an update on where we are. So quite clearly, obviously COVID, like everything else, has put everything on hold, but the day job still fits into it. And what COVID is actually doing, I'm sure it's the same in all of your countries, is it's pushing the agenda forward slightly. So some of the things that we've wanted to achieve and found difficult, such as cooperative working, developing with food producers, engaging with small businesses and farm shops, they're actually finding that business is booming. Particularly in our rural areas where access to food is difficult, or access to supermarkets is difficult, to travel. So that's a really interesting situation. I'm sure it's the same in many of your rural areas. What it does do, what COVID has done for us, is given us a rethink on food poverty. So I just want to touch on that, if I may. I'm in the process of putting a paper together on food poverty in particular, or inequality, because what we're finding is that the situation is that those that may never have found themselves in difficulties in accessing nutritional food, good nutritional food, are now in a process of finding that they can't afford the food, they can't get to the food, and they also are now approaching food banks, for example, which is now my day job at the moment. And what that is showing is that the poverty bracket is likely to go up rather than down, and that the inequality is becoming even more evident, that the complex nature of travel, of access to the foods, to the local shops, that in some rural areas where food is a local supply shop, which is increased the costs. So that inequality is becoming even more evident. So that's the piece that I'm working on at the moment, which I'll come back to. In terms of national procurement, we are currently still negotiating our contracts under the old NPS system, which has changed, which I think I heard Daniel speak about earlier on. It's slightly different to the English model. The NPS framework, which covers the whole of the system in the public sector, we are now being able to influence that more. And in Monmouthshire, we are just about to launch our pilot project, which links directly to procurement, which is how local is local, using local producers and products, and actually looking at how we analyse the data that sort of purchasing power, supply and demand, soil management, all of the different things that we need to do to increase the different types of approach in farming and diversification. So what we're looking to do is actually influence the agenda for future rather than looking backwards on the procurement system. Hope that makes sense. It's coming off the top of my head, this, guys. So on Wednesday next, we are resurrecting the food partnership, which was in abeyance because of the COVID situation. We're now going to a virtual meeting. We're having a demonstration of what the new system that we are piloting in Monmouthshire, which should go right across Wales and across borders. So let me just put that back in as well, because we're still continuing the work, or hopefully continuing the work with Gloucester. And what we'll be looking at is the types of questions we need to ask to analyse and understand our purchasing systems, whether they be dynamic purchasing systems, whether they be, because it is complex, where there's multi-use contracts. So some of it will be online, some of it will be within key agencies that we're continuing to use, but with a view to ensuring that they are actually looking at local as local, which hasn't happened before. So, and I'll give you an example of that, perhaps just to explain that a bit more simply, is currently Monmouthshire County Council, which has massive purchasing power, we use simple contractual procedures with some key major large businesses, and we are informed that they then, because we ask them to, that they only buy local when they bring in those supplies. We've been doing some work with those two of those local producers, suppliers, and what we find is local isn't local. So that for us is a big key shift, is for us to identify what we mean by local, to ensure that what we're doing is actually strategically not displacing other food purchases and actually bringing those into the system. So it's a massive change. It's a pilot. We've already got funding from Welsh Government, which they very kindly have already given us and put in our bank, which is lovely, with a view to now developing the spec with a consultant. So I can share that spec with you. It is draft at the moment, and it would be really, really useful from my perspective if you had some thoughts on, are we asking the right questions? Are we looking at the right processes? And what else should we bring into that? So that's the sort of the public procurement. And in terms of how we're dealing with the management of that, is we're engaging with Welsh Government, and they've put Caerphilly County Council in as a management processing lead, if you like, the lead body for the procurement systems. And we're tapping into the Caerphilly County Council local procurement officers. So we're bringing it down a level into the bottom-up approach. So instead of having a directive which says you must do, what we're doing is influencing that contractual procedure. So that itself is different. So, and hopefully better. What else to tell you, really? So that's procurement from a national perspective, Welsh Government perspective, national perspective, and then bottom-up approach. Engagement with our key suppliers, that's different. The analysis of, with Bryony's help, with Aberystwyth's help, of identifying and understanding what we mean by local and coming to sort of consensus on what local is, because it's different for different people and different organisations. And then bringing that into the fold. And I just heard at the back end of the last presentation about school meals. What we've been looking at with our school meals, and I agreed with the last presentation completely, we've been looking at our school meals processes as well, with COVID being the guiding factor here, and how our children can access nutritional food, hot meals, and not just tinned packet stuff that comes out of wherever. And what we did is we extended our what we call Momisha meals. So currently with our social services departments, where people are identified as either shielding or can't cook for whatever reason, maybe carers come in, what they do is they access it's a bit like, I don't know what you call it, sort of foil packaged meals, if you imagine that, transported to people. And our Momisha meals have extended that process for our social services, and we're looking to see whether there's a possibility of extending that, and we've already done that in some cases, to children who are eligible for school meals. So basically they get a drop-off meal rather than as well as the money that goes in the pockets of the parents to extend their economy for that week. So they get the money that the government gives them, which says you are entitled to free school meals. Here's some extra money because we appreciate that you can't get to the school to get it. But what we'll do is we're trying to extend that process to make sure that they get a delivered meal as well. So it's a nutritional basis rather than an economic basis. Also, I think it might be worth saying that we're looking at social shopping. And what we've identified is that given the situation at the moment, particularly, but also in the past, that affordable foods in the rural areas is difficult to access. Those on low economy, below the median level in our rural areas, they can't access, particularly now, budget food shopping. So that is pushing them again into poverty in the rural areas because of the access to the local community shops, can't get to them. They're using local corner shops, or where they can get fresh food and vegetables, it's usually organic or artisan, and that's pushing them. That's not affordable for them. So that's a situation, really. It's a statement rather than it's an update statement. So I think I'm going to stop there and ask if there's any questions on any of those.
Thank you, Desiree. Very interesting. If anybody has any questions, maybe my comment, I find it really interesting that the access to food in rural areas is problematic.
Yeah.
I guess the picture is much different here in Slovenia. It's vice versa, but then it's because of the completely different structure of agriculture in rural areas, you know, because we have small scale farmers, and most of the people kind of shop directly at farmers. And so it was actually urban population that had problems with food supply, let's say.
That's interesting. I find that quite interesting. I think it's safe to say in Monmouthshire we have pockets of urban areas which run along the M4 corridor belt, and then we have the rural hinterland. And I think it's safe to say that community spirit is very, very high. We've motivated and mobilized a number of community groups, so everybody's getting fed. There's neighbours feeding neighbours. We've got systems where people who can't get to the shops are shielding, have people that will go and get their shopping for them. They get a list and they go. We've also got priority online shopping. But it's interesting what you were saying there, to be honest, about we are generally in a rural area, and yet access to the farm shops, because of the increase in access, because there are more people trying to get to the farm shops, delivery is a problem. What we've been doing to support our farm shops is Monmouthshire County Council has been using our furlough drivers, so our transport unit, our pool cars, our local village buses, to actually do their deliveries to the smaller villages which wouldn't normally have accessed the farm shops.
Okay, interesting. Thanks very much.
It's okay. I hope that's clear. Let's say it's off the top of my head. I simply haven't had time to prepare well. So it's literally as it is.
No problem.
And it's nice to see you all, by the way.
Yeah, nice that you could join us. Great.
Yes,
thanks.
I'm actually, just so you can understand why I needed to hop off earlier on, it wasn't being rude. I'm team lead for the food bank support, and food banks for those in crisis and emergency, and I had a bit of an emergency, so.
Yeah, understandable. I would then close the presentation session and just invite you, if you have any questions or comments, or questions for all the presenters, general comments and so on. If I may start, for me, it's interesting to see that there were different initiatives, probably through public procurement as well, or support for schools, for school meals to the children who cannot attend the school due to COVID. I have seen in the comments that this was the case in Latvia. It was similar in Slovenia, and Desiree also pointed out that they were doing this as well. So an interesting observation.
Can I ask a question? Is
yes.
that, oh, sorry. I was really interested in some of the stuff that Daniel particularly, and we can catch up later, obviously, Dan, put forward about the dynamic procurement. It is different in England as in Wales, and we did have a presentation from the same person that Daniel was talking about. And I'm really, really interested in how that works from a concept of quick access. How do our farmers, producers, upload their information as quickly as a daily basis? That's really interesting. Because our farmers here, what we found, our farm and producers don't have the skills to the digital skills. So is there somebody in place that is uploading this information, or are they doing it individually?
Yeah, I can quickly answer that. As far as I know, what's happening in the Bath program, what happened was that people were uploading information digitally via smartphones. That, of course, isn't always possible in some rural areas. So I think what's happening there is that people were phoning into the office and leaving a message with Rich, so that could be done manually, if you like. But yeah, it's a really good question, Des, because lots of areas have got, I mean, I live in a town of almost 30,000 people and have ridiculously bad signals. So it's a really good question that has to be ironed out in the DPS, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Del. And what we're trying to do at the moment is develop that support mechanism. So somebody who would be that liaison point, but absolutely valid. Not everybody can access or have the skills to access that sort of system.
Thanks. We are coming to the time that was planned to close the webinar, but I think we can also extend if there are some questions or comments. So anybody has any questions or comments?
Can I just ask a quick thing? I mean, it's been really lovely to take part, and it's been interesting to see many people from across the partnership and people we know are in practice. Some of my colleagues in Gloucestershire, I think, would be really keen to swap stories and hear more about other people's experiences, not so much from the academic side, but just the kinds of things that we've been discussing, like regulations, problems, rural-urban contrasts, different types of policies. So it would be great to think about how we can, you know, maybe raise some summary points. Certainly we can provide this recording to people who are interested, but I just wondered if there was a way we could either do another thing that was more based around the experience of practitioners, you know, almost like a little online conference for practitioners, or whether some bullet points could be drafted. Maybe that's something we could think about.
Sure. During our last COP meeting, which was done by Zoom, where the idea for this webinar popped up, well, the webinar was planned earlier, but then the idea was, there was this discussion about, you know, practitioners and researchers and so on. So at that time we decided to have, let's say, two webinars. One is this one for kind of closer group and sharing our, let's say, research findings and so on. And the other one was supposed to be more open, broadly advertised, also with Alison's help and so on. And that could be actually done the way you suggest, more like a conference than a kind of webinar, with more focus on discussion and exchange of experience. I was going to ask, what do you, at the end of the session, what would be the availability of all of you in terms of time? I was looking at organizing this in the second half of June. So I just wanted to check if this is a suitable time. I'm not sure what's the current situation with COVID, with other engagements that you might have and so on. But it would be definitely interesting to have members of Living Labs joining us and other people, practitioners, as you say, interested in this topic. So would end of June we be suitable, or should we just do it maybe later in September?
Moitza, I think it depends on who you want to bring to the table. If it's largely robust practitioners, I don't think it's much of a problem, but I think it would be really interesting if we could get a more diverse and international audience, like even try and bring in some North American experiences, broader European experiences. I would love to hear from a municipality who seems to be winning, who's doing this, like really, how are they managing it? Because I think we've identified the challenges and the blockages to doing an ideal system. So I'd really be curious myself to learn from municipalities or districts that are really doing a really good job at this. And maybe that takes some time to find out who they are, invite them, and create a roundtable or a conference or a panel or something that I think a lot of people would be interested in seeing. What do you think? I mean, the fall is going to be stuffed with events because everything is getting postponed to fall, and then everybody's watching the situation with COVID-19 to see what happens with the second wave and so forth. So we may need to be a little bit flexible, but I think conceptually it's a great idea. It's something a lot of people would be interested beyond robust community. And I would certainly be willing to reach out to the Eclade Network and beyond to see if we could get some different people to participate.
Yeah, sounds good to me, because this would also then extend the reach of Robust as a project as well, you know, and bring additional input, let's say, in our work. So yeah, so this would then take much more time, but I think the results would be much more interesting as well. So I would go for that.
Okay.
What about the others? Dan was already giving a thumb up, so excellent. Wales is on board as well. Yeah, Michaelis as well. Great.
Great.
So I would go for that. Yeah.
Okay, let's do it. Let's I'd say internally robust, start brainstorming who the best practice, who's doing the best jobs, and then we can reach out to our contact lists and see who we can get to come.
Excellent. Great. Thanks.
Can I just share a thought? I was thinking that this dynamic procurement system would be really interesting for our local food policy, but we would not offer a best practice. We would be learning from what's happening in England. So I'm not sure if the webinar is the best means, but I'm sure that the food policy people would be willing to know more. So maybe think of a way, and also if Dan agrees, to be a transit of information myself to share this practice.
Yeah, I'm very happy to do that. We're doing various farmer workshops in the next month or two online, and then the regional workshop will be probably developing in parallel with the work we're doing with the County Council on school meals. So yeah, I'd be very happy to share in any way that helps.
Excellent. There's always, there's always opportunity to share and between the two living labs anyway. So, okay, now it's absurd to talk about the travel costs for meeting living lab partners, but still that's an option maybe for later. But if there are, similarities or possibilities to cooperate on kind of between two living labs, go ahead. Maybe Lisbon and Ljubljana can be in touch over similarity of issues and so on as well. So I'm open, we're open for that as well. Cool. Any other comments or questions for the last presenters? I kind of promised that there would be a chance at the end. No. Okay. I wrote down some issues, let's say for wrap up. So I'll just share the screen and try to wrap up then this webinar. Okay. So I think all the cases that we have seen have shown that the public procurement is quite a powerful tool that can shorten food supplies and improve sustainability. But of course, it has certain weaknesses on which situation can be improved. We talked all about administrative burden, about limitations, how to bring in the quality criteria. Lisbon gave a good example, and so on. And there are various aspects and issues that influence actually the extent of public procurement. I think there were several presentations that pointed out how the engagement with the suppliers and food producers is necessary. This was definitely the case of Ljubljana. Tukums pointed this out, and Lisbon, I think, pointed out the difference between these kind of local suppliers and the big suppliers. So one important issue. Then there's policy making issues and openness for innovation, like the dynamic procurement system sounds fantastic, but personally, I can't say that I can see it being implemented in Slovenia for quite a while, because it's just such a different approach that will actually need changes in the policies and so on. And there are also issues of governance and, let's say, skills and knowledge transfer. Here I see the issue of producers, so suppliers getting into the system is probably quite strongly linked to this. Dan talked about this quite extensively at the beginning. And basically we all talked a bit about the synergies with other sectors, institutions. There are very strong aspects of public health related also to poverty issues that Desiree pointed out that they're dealing now with in Wales. The issues of education, knowledge, and the environmental, let's say, impacts, consequences. Let me see if there's anything else. There's also, I think we all kind of touched a bit on the question of scale. In Slovenia, we have problems of small farmers who are too small to be competitive. Tukums, on the other hand, showed that their tenders are too small for the to be interesting for the farmers. I like this dynamic procurement system, how farmers can just join or drop out if they decide to go for a different approach or for different buyer. So there are different, let's say, ways of doing this. And this outsourced food supply that came up a couple of times can have some positive or negative influences in terms of how can you influence it with public procurement and ensure the quality, that the quality stays the same and that there's sustainability of food provided. So these are my points that I managed to catch. But I'll write up kind of a brief summary, let's say, of the webinar, of issues presented and points made. So this is my wrap up. Any comments or questions? Any additional points?
People are asking for copies of the presentation and a recording of the webinar. So I think we'll package this all up together when the things are prepared and send it out to everybody who attended.
Yes, great. Thanks for reminding me. So we'll make a brief summary and you'll get also the materials, and we'll arrange for the recording as well to be accessible. So
super. With that, I'll stop the recording now.
Okay, great. Thanks.